Imagine being wrongfully convicted for a crime you didn't commit. Now, imagine that the very person who sentenced you to prison is haunted by the mistake years later. This is the incredible story of a black man who faced unimaginable injustice in a courtroom, only to see a twist of fate years later. When the judge who handed down his sentence looked back on the case, regret and guilt took over. But how did this moment of reflection change everything for both men? And was it too late to fix the damage done? In this video, we'll take you through the gripping journey of one man's fight for justice and the unexpected turn that no one saw coming. Stay tuned as we uncover the shocking events that led to the judge's moment of regret and whether redemption was ever truly possible. It all started 5 years ago when Marcus Johnson, a young black man with no prior criminal record, was arrested for a crime he didn't commit. The evidence against him seemed overwhelming at the time: eyewitness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and a flawed investigation. Despite his protests of innocence, the judge, a respected figure in the community, sentenced him to a lengthy prison term. His conviction sent shockwaves through his family, but nothing could prepare Marcus for the life behind bars that would follow. What no one knew, though, was that a few years into his sentence, the truth began to slowly unravel. New evidence surfaced, and questions about the case started to emerge. The judge, who once believed the conviction was solid, began hearing murmurs of doubt. Was Marcus truly guilty, or had an innocent man been sent to prison for a crime he didn't commit? The answers were starting to come into focus, but the clock was ticking, and there was no turning back the clock. As the years went by, Marcus's world in prison became one of routine and survival. But behind the walls, something was shifting. The district attorney who had originally pushed for Marcus's conviction started to second-guess his role in the case after hearing whispers of new evidence. Rumors circulated about a potential witness who had come forward, claiming to have seen the real perpetrator, someone who, coincidentally, had been involved in another crime at the same time. This new lead, though, wasn't enough to overturn the case just yet. Meanwhile, Marcus's family never stopped fighting for his release. His mother, devastated yet determined, kept pushing through the legal system, tirelessly contacting lawyers and anyone who might help. But even with the new developments, the process was painfully slow, and hope seemed to dwindle with each passing year. Then there was Judge Thomas Avery. He had always been seen as a pillar of justice, a man who followed the law to the letter. But deep inside, doubts began to creep into his mind. He kept going over the trial in his head, replaying the moments when key pieces of evidence had been overlooked or ignored. The weight of it all became unbearable. Was he too blinded by the courtroom pressure? Had his biases shaped the decision? Now, 5 years later, Avery could not shake the guilt that gnawed at him. The truth had begun to surface, but the consequences of his actions were too great to ignore. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, he remained in a delicate position. Could he risk exposing his own mistakes, or would he stay silent, hoping the truth would stay buried? As Marcus's hope grew with the new evidence, so did the urgency. The new witness, a former inmate who had been in the same facility as the real criminal, had finally agreed to testify. The truth was coming to light, but it wasn't guaranteed to change anything. The system had a way of closing ranks, and even with a witness willing to speak, Marcus still had to fight against years of legal inertia and institutional resistance. In the meantime, Judge Avery's turmoil deepened. Late at night, he'd sit in his study, the case file in front of him, struggling with a decision that weighed on him more heavily each day. A quiet knock on his door one evening made him freeze. It was his colleague, the district attorney who had once pushed for Marcus's conviction. The DA, a man Avery had known for years, stood in the doorway with a file in his hand, his face pale. "There's something you need to see," the DA said quietly, placing the file on the desk. Avery opened it to find a detailed report that implicated not only the real criminal, but several others who had been involved in the mishandling of evidence. As he read, the pieces of the puzzle snapped together. The corruption went deeper than he'd ever imagined. The pressure was building now, not just from the legal world, but from his own conscience. Avery knew what was at stake: his career, his reputation, and perhaps even his freedom. But could he really stand by and let an innocent man rot in prison because of his own error in judgment? The clock was ticking, and every passing day made the stakes higher. But Avery wasn't the only one facing impossible choices. Marcus, alone in his cell, had no idea that the judge who condemned him was now facing his own reckoning. All he knew was that the walls were closing in, and with each new piece of information, he could feel the weight of justice slowly tipping in his favor. Would it be enough? Would they allow him the chance at freedom he so desperately deserved? The final moment of truth was approaching, but it was still unclear whether justice would be served, or if it would be too late. Just when it seemed like Marcus might finally get the justice he deserved, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived for him one morning, handed through the bars by the prison guard. It was from the same witness who had been ready to testify on Marcus's behalf, the former inmate who had seen the real criminal in action. But the letter wasn't a message of support, it was a warning. The witness had been threatened. His life was at risk if he moved forward with his testimony. A few cryptic words on the page made it clear. Powerful people were still invested in keeping the truth buried. Marcus felt a cold knot in his stomach. His one chance at freedom was now hanging by a thread. But what could he do from behind bars? He had no way of protecting the witness or stopping the forces that were clearly working to silence him. His heart raced as he thought of the consequences. If the witness backed down, everything they had worked for would unravel. Meanwhile, Judge Avery's inner conflict reached a breaking point. The revelation of corruption in the case had shaken him to his core, but now he faced a new dilemma. The DA's file had uncovered not just mistakes, but deliberate cover-ups, implicating several key figures in law enforcement who were still in positions of power. Avery knew he couldn't stand by without speaking out, but his fear of retaliation was suffocating. The system that had allowed Marcus to be convicted was so deeply entrenched that exposing the truth could destroy everything in its path. And yet, as Marcus's life hung in the balance, Avery realized he had no choice but to act. But time was running out. The judge's growing desperation mirrored Marcus's, as both men faced a ticking clock that threatened to drown out the truth. If the witness was silenced, if the corruption remained hidden, the stakes would rise even higher, leaving them both trapped in a system they could no longer trust. The final confrontation was near, but would it come in time for justice to prevail, or would the darkness of the past swallow them whole? The day of the hearing arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. Marcus sat in his prison uniform, heart pounding, wondering if today would be the day he was finally set free. The new evidence, the witness who had come forward, and the mounting pressure on Judge Avery had created an atmosphere of suspense that no one could ignore. But the last-minute threat to the witness loomed over everything. Marcus's fate seemed to be hanging by a thread. Then, just as the hearing was about to begin, something happened that no one expected. The door to the courtroom burst open, and the witness, the former inmate, walked in. His face was bruised, his eyes filled with fear, but he stood tall. The moment he took the stand, the room went silent. He didn't just recount what he had seen. He revealed the full extent of the corruption he had uncovered, naming names, pointing to key players who had manipulated the entire case. It was a stunning revelation. The courtroom was in shock, but the real twist came moments later. Just as the defense team prepared to present this new bombshell evidence, the DA, the same person who had once fought so hard for Marcus's conviction, stood up and made an unexpected move. He walked over to the judge, his face pale, and quietly placed a sealed envelope on the desk. The DA's voice trembled as he spoke. "Your Honor, I can no longer support this. The truth can't stay hidden anymore. Everything in that file is true." The room fell into stunned silence. The DA had not just turned on the system, he had turned on his entire career. The evidence he had been holding back for so long, the information he knew could destroy everything, was now in the open. Judge Avery, whose face had been a mask of conflict for weeks, now stood up slowly, his expression hardening. He glanced at Marcus, his eyes filled with regret and an unspoken apology. With a deep breath, he addressed the court. "I can no longer pretend that this trial was fair. We have failed to deliver justice, and I am part of that failure." And then, just as the weight of the moment seemed to settle in, a final twist hit like a thunderclap. The defense team, in the middle of celebrating their breakthrough, received a phone call. It was the prison. "Mr. Johnson," the officer on the other end said, "there's something you need to know. Your sentence, it's been overturned." But before anyone could react, a new voice, one they hadn't heard in years, spoke up. It was Marcus's mother, who had been waiting outside the courtroom. "Marcus, something's wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "I just heard they found something else. The case isn't over yet." The courtroom fell silent as Marcus's heart sank. Could it really be true? Had there been another layer of deception, something even worse than what they had uncovered? As the doors to the courtroom swung open once more, it became clear. The fight for justice was far from over. And though Marcus's path to freedom had just begun, there were still secrets left to unravel. Secrets that would leave everyone questioning who, in the end, was truly free. As the courtroom waited in suspense, Marcus's mother entered, holding a small piece of paper. She handed it to the defense attorney, who read it aloud. The final twist wasn't a cover-up, it was a confession. The real criminal had been arrested on unrelated charges, and in a final act of remorse, had admitted to framing Marcus all those years ago. The web of lies, corruption, and fear was finally unraveled. Judge Avery, once a symbol of authority, stepped down, accepting his responsibility. He personally called for Marcus's immediate release, offering an apology that felt too little, too late. The entire system had failed him, but Marcus had never given up. As he walked out of that courtroom a free man, the weight of the past lifted, but the scars remained. This story is a reminder that justice doesn't always come quickly, but truth has a way of finding its way out. Marcus's fight was more than just for his freedom. It was a battle for a broken system to be held accountable.